Peopling the Planet, How One African Family Inherited the Earth. Chapter 1, The Person on the Beach. I want you to begin by standing on a beach. It is somewhere in the islands of Southeast Asia, and it is a very long time ago, let us say 50,000 years, give or take. The sun is going down behind you. In front of you there is the sea, and beyond the sea there is nothing. Not nothing as in empty water. Nothing as in you cannot see what is out there. No land on the horizon, no smudge of distant hills, no column of smoke, nothing but open ocean, going on and on until it falls off the edge of the world. And here is the thing I want you to feel, standing on that beach in that body with that mind. You are about to get into a boat or onto a raft or a bundle of lashed reeds. We honestly don't know exactly what, and you are going to paddle out toward that empty horizon. On purpose, with your family, with children, with everything you own and everyone you love. You have no map, you have never seen the place you are going. You have, in the most literal sense, no evidence that it exists at all. And yet somehow, in that skull, behind those eyes, there is a thought no creature on this planet had ever really been able to think before, and the thought is something like, there is land out there, I cannot see it, but I believe it is there, and I am going to go and find it. And you do. You cross 70, 80, 90 kilometers of open ocean, out of sight of land, and you arrive on the shore of a continent, the one we now call Australia, that no human foot has ever touched. You are the first. You step out of the boat onto a beach at the bottom of the world, and you have just done something that, as far as we know, nothing else in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth had ever done quite like this. I find that almost unbearably moving, and I want you to sit with why. Because that person on the beach is your ancestor, not in some loose, poetic, we're all connected way. I mean it precisely. If you trace the line back far enough, and we can actually read it in the chemistry of your cells, every single human being alive on this planet today, all 8 billion of us, every nation, every color, every language, descends from a small population of people in Africa. And from that homeland, in a great slow explosion that is the subject of this whole journey, our ancestors walked, and paddled, and froze, and starved, and dared their way onto every habitable scrap of land on the face of the earth. Think about the sheer scale of it. We are, by the standards of the animal kingdom, a deeply unimpressive creature. We are slow. We have no claws, no fangs, no fur, no venom, no shell. A leopard would make short work of us. And yet this one naked, slow, soft-skinned African ape spread out until it was living in the frozen dark of the Arctic, and in the burning sand of the Sahara, and in the thin air of the Tibetan Plateau 4 kilometers above the sea, and in the dripping heart of the rainforest, and on tiny specks of island in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. There is no other large animal that has done anything remotely like this. We went everywhere. We are the only species that did. And that right there is the central mystery I want us to chase together. How? How did one African population end up owning the entire planet? Why did they leave a continent they had lived in perfectly well for hundreds of thousands of years? What was it in that particular mind, the imagining mind, the mind that can believe in a beach it has never seen, that made it possible? And maybe the most astonishing question of all, the one I genuinely cannot get over, how on earth do we know any of this? Because here is the situation. These people left no writing. There were no Sumerians yet, no clay tablets, no kings inscribing their names. For almost this entire story, there is not one written word. There will not be a written word for tens of thousands of years after it is over. These ancestors are utterly silent. They vanished without a single sentence. And yet we can now tell you, with real confidence, that a woman who lived in India 50,000 years ago belonged to a particular branch of the family, and that her descendants turned south and east, while another group turned north. We can tell you that a girl who died in a Siberian cave 90,000 years ago had a Neanderthal mother and a father of a completely different kind of human. We can tell you to within a few thousand years, when the first people stepped onto Australia and the Americas and the last empty islands of the Pacific. We have learned to make the silent dead speak, not through their words, because they left none, but through their bones and their garbage, and above all through the four-letter chemical code they left behind in every one of their descendants, including, right now, in you. That is the journey we are going to take together. It is the oldest story there is, older than every civilization, older than farming, older than the last ice age. It is the story of how we became a planetary species. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you are going to look at a world map and at the strangers on your street and at the very face in your mirror in a way you never have before. Because you are going to understand in your bones that there is no such thing as a stranger. There is only family that left earlier. So let me start the way every good mystery should start. Not at the beginning of the events, we'll get there, but with the detectives. Because before I can tell you what happened, I have to tell you the almost unbelievable story of how we found out. Let me tell you how we learned to read the dead. Chapter 2: How we learned to read the dead. For most of human history, the deep past was a locked room with no door. Think about it. If a people leave no writing, how could you ever know they existed, let alone where they walked or who they loved or who their grandchildren were? For thousands of years, the honest answer was, you couldn't. Before about 50,000 years ago, before the first cave paintings even, the human story seemed destined to be permanently, hopelessly silent. We could dig up an old skull and say, well, here is a skull. And that was nearly the end of it. And then in our own lifetimes, and I want to stress that, because this is one of the great thrills of being alive right now, a door appeared in that wall. Two doors, actually, and they swung open so fast and showed us so much that they have completely rewritten the human story in the space of a single generation. A textbook printed when I was young is, in places, simply wrong now. We are living through the single greatest era of discovery about our own origins that there has ever been. I get to tell you a story that almost nobody who came before us got to hear. The first door is genetics, and the man who pried it open more than any other is a Swedish scientist named Svante Pääbo, and I have to tell you how he started, because it is wonderful. In 1985, Pääbo was a young researcher who became quietly obsessed with a forbidden question. Could you get DNA, the genetic code, the instruction book of life, out of something that was dead and ancient? Everyone assumed the answer was no. DNA falls apart after death. Surely after thousands of years there would be nothing left to read. But Pääbo, partly in secret, got hold of ancient Egyptian mummies, and he managed to extract and copy a tiny scrap of genuine DNA from a mummy more than 2,000 years old. He described seeing the band appear on the gel in his laboratory, the physical signal of that ancient genetic code, and feeling that he was looking at something no one was ever supposed to see again. The instruction book of a person who had been dead since before the Roman Empire. That was the crack of light, but it turned out to be the easy part. Because ancient DNA has a vicious enemy, and the enemy is contamination. The genetic material in old bones is shattered into tiny fragments, and there is hardly any of it left. And meanwhile, every one of us, every scientist, every person who has ever touched the bone, is shedding our own fresh, intact, modern DNA all over everything. It is appallingly easy to extract some ancient bone, read the DNA, and discover you have triumphantly sequenced the genome of the graduate student who handled it. Through the 1990s, a string of exciting results: DNA from dinosaurs, DNA from insects in amber, the stuff of Jurassic Park, turned out to be exactly this kind of mirage. The field nearly died of embarrassment. What Perbo and the people around him did, slowly, over years, was build a fortress of carefulness. Clean rooms like surgical theaters, suits and masks, chemical tricks to spot the particular damage that only genuinely old DNA carries. They turned a wild, romantic idea into a rigorous science. And once they had done that, they aimed it at the most tantalizing target imaginable. Not an ancient human like us, but another kind of human entirely. The Neanderthals. And in 2010, they did it. Perbo's team published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, the genetic code of a different human species, one that had been extinct for tens of thousands of years. We could read the genes of beings that no living person had ever seen. For this whole body of work, Perbo was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2022, and I can't think of one more deserved. I will tell you the staggering things the Neanderthal genome revealed when we get to Europe, because they deserve their own chapter. But I want you to hold on to the method, because it is going to be our companion the whole way. We can now take a sliver of a 40,000-year-old bone, or a tooth, or, and this still astonishes me, a scoop of plain dirt off a cave floor, and pull out of it the genetic identity of the people who lived and bled and died there. We can read the dead from their leftovers. The silence is broken. Now, the genetic door has a famous companion concept that I have to clear up right away, because the popular version of it is badly misleading, and getting it right will make everything else make sense. You have probably heard of mitochondrial Eve. Here is the deal. There is a special little loop of DNA called mitochondrial DNA that you inherit only from your mother, who got it only from her mother, and so on, back and back, in an unbroken female line. Because it passes down cleanly like that, it works like a surname that only daughters carry. And if you follow every living person's maternal line backward, they all eventually converge on a single woman who lived in Africa somewhere around 150 to 200,000 years ago. The newspapers called her Mitochondrial Eve. And immediately everyone pictured the wrong thing. They pictured a literal first woman, alone in a garden, the mother of us all. That is not what she was, and the truth is more interesting. Mitochondrial Eve was not the first woman, and she was not alone. She lived in a large population of thousands of women. She was an ordinary person. The only thing special about her is purely a matter of accounting. Hers is the one maternal line that happens to have survived unbroken down to the present, because every generation, by sheer chance, some lines die out. A woman has only sons, or no children, and her mitochondrial surname vanishes. Run that lottery for 10,000 generations, and eventually all the surviving lines trace back to one lucky lineage. She is a bookkeeping fact, not a lonely mother. And by the way, there is a Y chromosome Adam, too, traced down the father's line, and crucially, he and Eve did not live at the same time and never met. They are not a couple. They are just the two surviving root points of two different family trees. I labor this because it is the perfect introduction to the spirit of this whole enterprise. The deep past is full of stories that are almost true and tidier than the truth, and we are going to be honest the whole way. The real story is messier than the myth, and the real story, I think, is always more thrilling for being real. So that is the first door, the chemistry of the living, read backward into the dead. Now let me show you the second door, because DNA can tell you about relationships, but it is strangely bad at telling you when. For that, we need a completely different kind of magic. We need to learn how to read the age of the Earth itself. Chapter 3: Clocks in the Dirt. Here is a problem I had genuinely never thought about until I fell in love with this subject, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Suppose you dig up a stone tool, or a burnt bone, or a human jaw. How do you know how old it is? You cannot just look at it. A stone scraper made 40,000 years ago looks much like one made 4,000 years ago. There is no date stamped on it, and the people who made it left no calendar. So how does anyone get to say, with a straight face, this campfire was lit 65,000 years ago? For most of the history of archaeology, the honest answer was that they were more or less guessing, clever guessing, ordering things by which layer sat on top of which, but guessing. And then, in the 20th century, we discovered that the Earth is full of clocks. You just have to know how to read them. The most famous one is radiocarbon dating, and it is beautiful. While you are alive, you are constantly taking in carbon from the world, from food, from the air, and a tiny, fixed fraction of that carbon is a slightly unstable variety called carbon-14. The moment you die, you stop taking it in, and the carbon-14 already in your body begins, very slowly and very precisely, to break down and disappear at a perfectly steady rate. So if you measure how much carbon-14 is left in an old piece of bone or wood or charcoal, you can calculate how long ago that thing stopped living. It is a clock that starts ticking at the moment of death. It is a wonderful clock. It even got an upgrade in the 1980s, a technique called accelerator mass spectrometry that counts the carbon atoms directly, so that instead of needing a big destructive lump of material, you can date a single tooth, a thread, a crumb. But radiocarbon has one brutal limitation that you have to understand because it shapes this entire story. The carbon-14 runs out. After about 50,000 years, there is so little of it left that the signal drowns in noise, and the clock simply stops being readable. And here is the heartbreak. Almost everything in our story is older than that. The dispersal out of Africa, the crossing to Australia, the meeting with the Neanderthals, most of it happens right at, or beyond, the edge of what radiocarbon can see. The most important chapter in human history takes place mostly in the dark, just past the reach of our best clock. So we needed other clocks, and we found them, and they are ingenious. My favorite is called luminescence dating, and the idea behind it is so strange and lovely that I want to walk you through it slowly. Grains of sand, ordinary quartz sand, act like tiny rechargeable batteries. Buried in the ground, they are constantly soaking up a faint trickle of natural radiation from the surrounding soil, and they store that energy trapped inside their crystal structure. The longer they stay buried in the dark, the more energy they accumulate. But here is the trick. Sunlight wipes them clean. Expose a grain of sand to daylight, and it dumps all its stored energy and resets to zero. Do you see what that means? It means that the last time a grain of sand saw the sun, the moment it was buried, say when an ancient person dug a pit or dropped a tool and it got covered over, that is the moment the clock started. So an archaeologist can take sand from the layer around a buried artifact and in a darkroom stimulate those grains with light and measure how much energy they release. The brighter the glow, the longer since that sand last saw daylight. They are quite literally measuring the last sunrise those grains ever witnessed, tens of thousands of years ago. And the very best version of this dates individual grains, one by one, which is how, at a site in Australia called Majidbeb, researchers were able to say and stake their reputations on it, that people were living there at least 65,000 years ago. We'll come back to that astonishing date. There are more clocks. There is uranium-thorium dating, which reads the slow chemical transformation inside the rock of cave formations, the stalactites and flowstones that grow drip by drip over the ages, and which has let us date the calcite crust over a cave painting and prove that some of the oldest art on Earth was made more than 40,000 years ago. There is the molecular trick of reading collagen in a bone fragment to tell, in minutes, whether a tiny, unidentifiable splinter came from a reindeer or a human, which is exactly how that astonishing hybrid girl in Siberia was found, by sorting through thousands of nothing special bone chips until one of them turned out to be one of us. But I would be a dishonest guide if I made it all sound clean and certain. So let me tell you about the failures, because they are part of the thrill, and they are how you know the science is real. There is a famous site in California called the Cerruti Mastodon, where in 2017 a team published an extraordinary claim: smashed mastodon bones and some heavy stones that, they argued, showed humans had been in the Americas 130,000 years ago. Now, that would be staggering. It is roughly 10 times older than the accepted arrival, and it is so old that, on the other side of the world, our species had barely even finished becoming itself. And the scientific community looked hard at it and on the whole said, no, those bones could have been broken by natural forces, by the weight of sediment or the churning of a river. There are no proper tools, no human remains, none of the usual signature of a real campsite. The claim almost certainly doesn't hold. I tell you that not to mock anyone making bold claims, and testing them to destruction is exactly the job, but because it shows you the immune system of this science working. Extraordinary claims get hammered, and it cuts both ways. We are going to meet several dates in this story that sounded impossible when they were announced and turned out to be solid, and a few that sounded thrilling and melted under scrutiny. Learning to tell those apart, to sit honestly in the space between proven and possible, is the real intellectual adventure here. The fun is not in pretending we know everything. The fun is in knowing exactly where the edge of our knowledge is and standing right on it, looking out. One more thing the clocks taught us, and it is a humbling one. A vast amount of the evidence is simply gone, and not randomly. During the ice ages, so much of the world's water was locked up in ice that the sea level dropped by more than 100 meters, and huge plains stood dry where there is now open ocean. People being people, they loved those coasts, rich in shellfish, easy to travel along. And then the ice melted, the seas came back up and drowned all of it. Some of the most important real estate in the human story, the actual beaches our ancestors walked, the coastal trail out of Africa and on toward Australia, is now sitting under tens of meters of seawater, out on the continental shelf, almost impossible to dig. So when the record looks thin in places, we have to remember, we are reading a book with whole chapters torn out and thrown in the sea. Now we have our tools. We can read relationships in the DNA and ages in the dirt. So let us point them at the beginning of everything and ask the first real question. Where did we come from? Where exactly is home? Chapter 4. The whole continent was the cradle. For a long time, there was a lovely, simple picture of where we came from, and it went like this. Somewhere in East Africa, in the Great Rift Valley, that dramatic gash of volcanoes and lakes running down through Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania, a single small population of apes slowly became us. There was a cradle, a Garden of Eden, one specific place where Homo sapiens switched on. And from that one spot we spread. It is a tidy story, and like a lot of tidy stories in this field, the evidence has been quietly dismantling it, and what is replacing it is, to my mind, far more beautiful. Let me take you to the place that broke the old picture. It is called Jebel Irhoud, and this is the first surprise. It is not in East Africa at all. It is in Morocco, in the far northwest of the continent, almost in sight of the Mediterranean. For years, the fossils found they were a bit of a puzzle, filed away and half ignored. But when a team went back and re-excavated and redated the site, they got a number that genuinely shocked them. The human remains at Jebel Irhoud were about 315,000 years old. That made them the oldest fossils of our own species, Homo sapiens, ever found, by a huge margin, and they were sitting in the wrong corner of the continent entirely, thousands of kilometers from the supposed cradle. And the faces of those people tell their own remarkable story. If you saw the front of one of their skulls, the face, the cheekbones, the small brow, you might not look twice. It looks like us. But the back of the skull is long and low, more archaic, not yet the high round brain case we carry. They were a work in progress, a mosaic, a face from the future on the back half of a more ancient head. Once you start looking, this mosaic pattern is everywhere across Africa, and that is the whole point. There is a skull from Florisbad in South Africa, around 260,000 years old, with the same blend of old and new. There are the famous fossils from Omo and from Hatu in Ethiopia, well over 150,000 and perhaps over 200,000 years old, sitting at different points along that same path from archaic toward modern. North, south, east, across the entire vast continent, at roughly the same deep time, we find these in-between people, each one a slightly different mixture of the ancestral and the modern. So what does it mean? The current best reading, and I love this idea, is that we did not have a single cradle at all. We were not born in one valley. Instead, across the whole enormous continent of Africa, scattered populations of early humans were living in different regions, each evolving a little differently, each working out its own version of modern features. And crucially, they were not sealed off from one another. Africa's climate was constantly shifting. Wet periods opened green corridors across what is now desert, then dry periods closed them again. And as the corridors opened and shut, these scattered groups would meet and mix and exchange genes and ideas, and then drift apart again. Modern humanity was not assembled in one place from one blueprint. It was stirred together over hundreds of thousands of years out of many populations across an entire continent. We are a Pan-African creature. The whole continent was the cradle. I find that genuinely moving, and I'll tell you why. It means our origin was never about purity or a single bloodline. From the very first, before we had even finished becoming ourselves, we were a mixture, a network, a conversation between peoples. The mixing that I am going to spend this whole journey describing, the constant meeting and merging of human groups, is not something that happened to us along the way. It is what we are made of. It is in the foundation. Now I owe you some honesty, because this is a live debate and not a settled fact, and I promised we would always stand right on the edge of what is known. Not everyone weights the evidence the same way. Some researchers still argue for a more focused origin, with one region, often somewhere in southern or eastern Africa, as the main wellspring, and the other populations as more of a supporting cast. The fossils are few, and a few new bones in the ground could shift the picture again. What almost everyone now agrees on is the big thing. We are an African species. We became ourselves in Africa, and we spent the overwhelming majority of our existence, something like 9/10 of the entire history of Homo sapiens, living only there, on that one continent, never setting foot anywhere else. And that raises the question that this whole episode is really about, the question that should be nagging at you by now. If we had been in Africa successfully for 250,000 years and more, if that was home, and we knew it, and we thrived there, then why? Why around 60 or 70,000 years ago did some of these people walk out of the only world their species had ever known and keep walking until they had covered the earth? What changed? What got into us? To answer that, we have to talk about the strangest and most wonderful transformation in the human story, the moment, or the long, slow dawn, when the human mind became something genuinely new. We have to talk about the birth of imagination. And for that, I want to take you to a cave on the southern coast of Africa and show you the oldest drawing in the world. Chapter 5, The Spark, How a Mind Learned to Imagine. On the southern coast of South Africa, where the land drops down to a cold, rich, blue-green sea, there is a cave called Blombos. It looks out over the water, and around 100,000 years ago, people lived in it. And in the floor of that cave, archaeologists have found some of the most precious objects I know of anywhere on Earth. Not gold, not jewels, far better than that. They found, for instance, a complete paint-making kit. 2 abalone shells, each used as a little container, and in them the dried residue of a reddish paste, ground-up ochre, that iron-rich red rock, mixed with crushed bone and charcoal and fat and stone, blended into a workable pigment. A toolkit for making color. And to make it, someone had to gather the ingredients from different places, know which ones to combine, prepare them in the right order, and store the result. That is planning. That is chemistry. That is a mind holding a multi-step recipe in its head 100,000 years ago. And then there are the beads. Little sea snail shells, dozens of them, each one deliberately pierced with a hole and worn smooth where it rubbed on a string. Somebody strung these shells and wore them. And I want you to really stop on that, because a bead is one of the most profound objects a human being can make. A bead is useless. You cannot eat it, you cannot cut with it, it will not keep you warm. Its entire purpose is to be seen, to say something, silently, to other people. I am someone, I belong to this group. I am married, I am powerful, I am beautiful, I am in mourning. A bead is a message. A bead is a symbol. And the moment a creature starts wearing symbols, that creature has a mind that runs on meaning, not just on hunger and fear. But my favorite object from Blombos, and this one gives me chills every single time, is a small piece of that red ochre stone, about 73,000 years old, and across one smooth, flat face of it, somebody has very deliberately drawn a pattern. A set of crossed lines, a crosshatch, a kind of hashtag scratched in ochre crayon. It is not an animal. It is not a tool mark. It does nothing. It is the oldest known drawing made by a human hand, and it is pure abstraction, a pattern made for the sake of making a pattern. Somebody, 73,000 years ago, sat in that cave and drew something for no practical reason at all, simply because the idea of it was in their head and they wanted to put it into the world. That to me is the spark. That is the thing. Because here is what I think is really going on, underneath all the beads and the ochre and the abstract lines. Something had happened to the human mind that had not happened to any mind before. Call it symbolic thought, call it imagination. It is the ability to hold in your head a thing that is not in front of you, a thing that does not yet exist, or that exists only as an idea. A pattern, a plan, a spirit, a god, a beach on the far side of an ocean you have never seen. And once you can do that, everything changes. You can plan a hunt for next season. You can tell a story that teaches your grandchildren something you learned and they never witnessed. You can imagine a tool before you make it and a journey before you take it. You can wonder what is over the horizon and then go. The imagining mind is the engine of this entire story. The person standing on that beach in Chapter 1, betting their life on an invisible land, could only do that because somewhere deep in our African childhood, our ancestors had become the animal that can picture what it cannot see. Now, when did this happen and how? And here, beautifully, we have a real fight on our hands, one of the great debates in the field. For a long time, the dominant idea, associated especially with the archaeologist Richard Klein, was that this was sudden, a kind of revolution around 50,000 years ago, maybe driven by some last genetic change in how the brain was wired, a switch that flipped and abruptly turned clever apes into symbolic, artistic, fully modern humans, right around the time we burst out of Africa. It is a dramatic, satisfying story. The lights come on, and off we go. But the evidence from places like Blombos has been steadily undermining it, and a rival camp, including researchers like Christopher Henschelwood and Curtis Marion, argues for something I find more convincing and honestly more profound. They point out that the beads, the ochre, the planning, the coastal shellfish harvesting, the abstract drawing, all of it shows up in Africa not 50,000 years ago, but 80, 100, even more thousand years ago, long before we left. So there was no single magic switch. Instead, behavioral modernity came on gradually, in fits and starts, flickering into life in one place and dying out and reappearing somewhere else, accumulating slowly over tens of thousands of years like a fire being coaxed up from embers. Less like a light switch, more like a sunrise. I lean toward the slow sunrise. But I want to be straight with you. This is genuinely unresolved, and good scientists disagree about it right now. And notice the deeper, almost philosophical point hiding underneath the argument. We tend to assume that being smart is the same as being modern, that as soon as you have a big brain, you get art and exploration and all the rest for free. But that is not what the record shows. Other humans before us and alongside us had brains as large as ours. Brain size was not the bottleneck. Something else, something about how we connected, how we taught each other, how widely we shared what we knew, how our growing populations let ideas ratchet up generation by generation instead of being constantly reinvented and lost. Something social and cumulative is what finally tipped us over into the creature that could fill a planet. We did not conquer the world because any one of us was a genius. We conquered it because we could pool our cleverness across a whole network of minds and pass it down a chain. We are not the smart ape. We are the connected ape. So now we have a population in Africa with the imagining mind switched on. And we have one more ingredient to add, the one that opens the gate, the climate, because Africa does not sit still. Driven by slow wobbles in the Earth's orbit, the great deserts breathe in and out, wet and dry, over tens of thousands of years. There were times, and one especially important window somewhere around 70 to 80,000 years ago, when the Sahara was not a desert at all but a green land of lakes and grass and grazing animals, and when the deserts of Arabia, just across the narrow mouth of the Red Sea, bloomed the same way, dotted with lakes and rivers and hippos and game. Do you see what that does? It throws open a door. For most of our history, a wall of desert sealed the only humans on Earth inside their continent. But when the rains came and the green corridors opened north and east, the wall briefly became a road. The imagining, restless, growing population of Africa could follow the grass and the water out across a Sahara that had turned to savanna, or out across a Red Sea crossing into a green Arabia. The mind was ready, the door was open. It was time to leave. Chapter 6. The First Steps Out. I have to start this chapter by undoing something because the phrase "out of Africa" makes it sound like a single event. One morning everybody packed up and marched north in a great column, and that was that. It was nothing like that. It was messier, slower, more human, and far more interesting, and it includes at least one heartbreaking failure before the success. Let me tell you about the failure first, because it is one of my favorite stories, and almost nobody knows it. If you go to two caves in what is now Israel, Eskal and Kafse, you find the bones of people who were unmistakably us, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and they were living there an astonishingly long time ago. Around 100,000 to 120,000 years ago. That is tens of thousands of years before the main exodus. So there were modern humans living outside Africa, in the Middle East, in the Levant, way back then. We made it out early. And then they vanish. After about 90,000 years ago, these modern humans disappear from the Levant for tens of thousands of years, and in their place, the region fills back up with Neanderthals. The early pioneers did not go on to conquer the world. As far as we can tell from the genetics of people alive today, that early exit left almost no lasting trace in any of us. It was a dead end. A door opened, a few brave families stepped through, and then the door closed again, and they either died out or retreated back home. Why did they fail when the later wave succeeded? We don't really know, and I love that we don't. Maybe the climate turned against them. Maybe the Neanderthals, who were superbly adapted to that cold northern world, simply outcompeted them. Maybe these early moderns had the modern body but had not yet fully developed the cultural toolkit, the wider networks, the more sophisticated technology that the later wave would carry. Whatever the reason, it is a humbling and very human reminder. The peopling of the planet was not destiny, it was not guaranteed. There were false starts and lost colonies and roads that led nowhere. We tend to tell the story of our species as an inevitable triumph. It was nothing of the kind. It was contingent and risky, and it could have gone differently. The exit that mattered, the one that everyone alive outside Africa descends from, came later, somewhere around 60 to 70,000 years ago. And we know it is the one that mattered for a precise and rather wonderful reason. When geneticists read the DNA of everyone on Earth who is not of recent African ancestry, every European, every Asian, every Native American, every Aboriginal Australian, every Pacific Islander, they all carry the signature of descent from a single ancestral population that left Africa in that window. All of us non-Africans are, genetically, a kind of large extended family, descended from one relatively small group of people who walked out of Africa in that fairly narrow slice of time. And that has a strange and beautiful consequence that I want to make sure you feel. The genetic diversity of the whole rest of the world, all the difference between a Sami reindeer herder and a Maori sailor and a Peruvian farmer and a Korean and an Inuit hunter. All of it is just a subset, a small sample of the diversity that already existed in Africa. When that founding group left, they could only carry a fraction of the human gene pool with them, the way a cup dipped into the ocean carries only a cupful. So to this day there is more genetic variety inside Africa than in all the rest of the human species combined. Hold on to that fact. It is going to matter enormously when we reach the end and talk about what all this means for that poisonous old idea, race. Now, which way did they go? There is a long-running and genuinely unresolved debate, and the honest answer is probably more than one way. There is a northern route, up through the Levant, the same corridor the failed pioneers used, the land bridge between Africa and Asia. And there is a southern route, across the narrow strait at the bottom of the Red Sea, the one the Arabs poignantly call Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Grief, and then along the coast of Arabia, hugging the shoreline of the Indian Ocean, living off shellfish, moving east beach by beach by beach. The southern coastal route is especially appealing because it explains the astonishing speed of what comes next. Coast hopping is fast, and the sea provides a reliable larder the whole way. The trouble, remember, is that those ancient beaches are now drowned under the risen sea, so the most direct evidence is frustratingly out of reach. And was it one wave or many? Again, probably many, overlapping, with the picture muddied further by something we are only now appreciating. The people leaving Africa did not walk into an empty world. There were already other kinds of humans out there, waiting, and our ancestors did not just pass them by. They met them, they fought them, perhaps. They traded with them, perhaps. And we now know this beyond any doubt because we can read it in your DNA right now. They had children with them. Which means that before we follow our ancestors deeper into Asia and on toward Australia and Europe and the Americas, I have to introduce you to the other people, the ones who were already there. Because one of the very biggest things the genetics revolution has taught us one of the discoveries that genuinely rewrote the textbooks in the last 15 years, is that for most of this story, we were not alone. Chapter 7. We Were Not Alone, The Cousins in the East. Picture the world our ancestors walked into as they spread east out of Africa sometime after 60,000 years ago. It was not empty. It was, in a way I find genuinely haunting, a world with other humans in it. Different kinds, other ways of being a person. In the West, in Europe and the Middle East, were the Neanderthals, stocky, powerful, cold-adapted, big-brained, and we'll spend real time with them in the next chapter. But further east, across Asia, were others. And the strangest of all of them, the one that best shows you how much the ground has shifted under our feet, is a people we discovered backwards. We read their genes before we had any idea what they looked like, and to this day we have barely seen their bones. They are called the Denisovans, and their discovery is one of the most extraordinary detective stories in all of science. It begins with a single scrap of a finger bone from a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave. The fragment was tiny, unremarkable, the kind of thing you would never look at twice. But when Svante Pääbo's team extracted DNA from it, expecting maybe a Neanderthal or an early modern human, the genetic code that came back matched nothing known. It was a human, clearly a kind of human, but a completely new kind, one nobody had ever suspected existed. An entire population of humanity, discovered not from a skeleton, not from a skull, but from the genes in one finger bone. We found a lost branch of our family from a chip of bone the size of a pebble. Let that tell you how powerful the genetic door has become. And then it got stranger and more wonderful, because in that same cave they later found another small bone fragment from a girl who died around 90,000 years ago, and when they read her genome, they found something almost too poetic to be real. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation child of two different kinds of human. We nicknamed her Denny. And she is not a metaphor or a maybe. She is a real girl, half one species and half another, who lived and breathed and then lay in the dark of that cave for 90,000 years until we found her and read the mingled book of her blood. The different kinds of humans were not staying politely apart. They were meeting and loving and having children all over the ancient world. Here is the part that brings it home to you, personally, in your own body. When our ancestors moved east and met these Denisovans, they did the same thing Denny's parents did. They interbred. And the proof is that the descendants of those couplings are alive today and carry Denisovan DNA in their cells. If you have ancestry from New Guinea or Aboriginal Australia, you carry something like 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA. People across East and Southeast Asia carry a smaller but real amount. A whole extinct kind of human, known mostly from a finger bone and a few teeth, lives on, quietly, inside millions of people walking around right now. And that ghostly inheritance turns out not to be useless baggage. In at least one case, it is a gift that lets people survive in a place that should be uninhabitable. Up on the Tibetan Plateau, 4 kilometers above sea level, the air is so thin that lowlanders who go there sicken, and pregnancies are dangerous, and the body strains to cope with too little oxygen. But Tibetans thrive up there, generation after generation, and the reason is a particular version of a gene that helps them handle low oxygen without thickening their blood to a dangerous degree. And when researchers traced where that life-saving gene variant came from, the answer was breathtaking. It is Denisovan. The Denisovans had lived in high, cold Asia for a very long time and had evolved to handle the altitude. And when modern humans arrived and interbred with them, some of us inherited that adaptation. And tens of thousands of years later, it is the reason an entire people can make their home on the roof of the world. We did not conquer that environment alone. We did it with a gift from a vanished cousin. There is even a deeper layer of ghosts. The genetic tools are now so sensitive that they can detect, in the DNA of living people, the faint fingerprints of other ancient populations we have never found at all, so-called ghost lineages. Archaic humans who left no fossil we have identified, known only as a strange signal in the genome, a whisper of an ancestor we cannot name. Some West African populations seem to carry traces of one such unknown ancient human. The family tree, it turns out, is not a tidy tree at all. It is a tangled, braided, interwoven thing with branches that reach across and fuse and exchange, lineages appearing and vanishing, everyone a little bit everyone else. Meanwhile, the main story rolls eastward fast. The evidence for modern humans pushing across southern Asia and into Southeast Asia piles up quickly. Ancient teeth and bones in caves in Laos at a place called Tam Pa Ling, deep in the interior, showing that people were not just hugging the coast but pressing inland into the rainforest. A skull and tools from Naya Cave in Borneo. Tantalizing, hotly debated hints from southern China at a site called Jiandong of modern-looking humans surprisingly early. In Sri Lanka, at Far Heen Cave, we find people who within a few thousand years of arriving had completely mastered the rainforest, hunting monkeys and squirrels in the canopy with tiny, precise, stone-tipped weapons, a feat of ecological cleverness that should impress anyone. Everywhere you look, the same theme, humans arriving in a wildly unfamiliar world and with astonishing speed figuring it out, reading a new land, cracking it. Now I have been deliberately quiet about one enormous place that all of these eastward travelers had to pass through, the great pivot of southern Asia, the subcontinent of India. It was the crossroads of this entire migration, the vast way station between Africa and everywhere east, and its story is so rich and so close to my heart that I am not going to rush it here. I am going to give it its own deep telling near the end of our journey when we have all the tools to do it justice. The supervolcano, the survival, the living descendants of the very first arrivals, the genetic history of a fifth of humanity. So hold the thought of India. I promise you we will come back to it properly. We will give it the chapter it deserves. For now, let us turn the other way. Because while one stream of humanity was flowing east toward the rising sun and the open Pacific, another was turning northwest, into the cold, into the land of the most famous other humans of all. It is time to go to Europe. It is time to meet the Neanderthals. Chapter 8, Into the Cold, the Neanderthals and Us. I have to begin by rescuing the Neanderthals from a slander, because for about a century we told a story about them that was not just unkind but flat wrong, and correcting it is one of the quiet triumphs of modern science. You know the cartoon. Neanderthal is practically an insult, a shambling, stooped, grunting, dim-witted brute, all brow and no brain, a failed rough draft of humanity that deservedly lost out to clever us. Almost every part of that is false. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, and in some cases larger. They had lived successfully in Ice Age Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than modern humans have existed as a species, surviving conditions that would kill most of us in a week. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They hunted enormous, dangerous animals cooperatively, at close range, with thrusting spears, which takes nerve and teamwork and planning. They cared for their injured and their sick, keeping alive individuals who could not have survived alone. They buried their dead. They made ornaments and used pigment. There is a strong case that they made art. These were not brutes. These were people, a different kind of people, but people through and through. And our ancestors met them. When modern humans pushed up into Europe, Sometime around 45,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had been the masters of that frozen continent for ages. For several thousand years, the two kinds of humans shared the same world, the same valleys, the same herds, the same bitter winters. And we know now exactly what happened when they met, because, just as in the East, we can read it in living DNA. They interbred. Every person on Earth whose ancestry lies outside Africa carries a small percentage, roughly 1 to 2%, some a little more, of Neanderthal DNA. If you are not of purely recent African descent, then woven through your chromosomes, in nearly every cell of your body, are genes that came from a Neanderthal ancestor who lived in Ice Age Eurasia, who met one of your modern human ancestors, and whose child carried both heritages forward to you. We even have the bones of some of the very first modern Europeans from a cave in Bulgaria called Barco, Cairo, whose genomes show they had a Neanderthal ancestor just a handful of generations back. Not distant, abstract mixing. A great-great-grandparent. The encounter was intimate, and it was immediate. I find that one of the most beautiful facts in all of human biology, we did not simply replace the Neanderthals or wipe them out or step over them. We absorbed some of them. They are not entirely gone. They are in us. When you shiver and your skin prickles in the cold, when your immune system fights off an infection, there is a real chance you are using a tool handed to you by a Neanderthal. Variants that helped them survive in Eurasia, and that natural selection kept because they helped our ancestors survive there too. And yet, and this is the haunting part, the Neanderthals as a separate people did vanish. By around 40,000 years ago, they are essentially gone. The last traces of them cling on in the far corners of Europe. One of the very last known refuges is in the caves of Gibraltar, that great rock at the southern tip of Spain, where it seems a final population held out, looking south across the strait toward Africa before they too disappeared. After hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthal story ends, right about the time ours in Europe begins. Why, this is one of the great whodunits, and I want to be honest that we do not have a clean answer. For a long time the assumption was simple. We killed them or outcompeted them. Smarter, better armed, better organized moderns drove the inferior Neanderthals to extinction. But the more we learn, the less that crude story holds up, and the more it looks like a convergence of pressures. The Neanderthals always lived in small, scattered, thinly spread populations. Their total numbers across all of Eurasia may never have been more than a few tens of thousands. Modern humans arrived in larger, more connected groups, with wider trade networks and perhaps a faster engine of cultural innovation. Add a brutally unstable Ice Age climate lurching back and forth. Add the slow demographic math of a small population being gradually absorbed and outbred by a larger one. And you do not need a war or a massacre. You need only that a small, sparse people, under stress, slowly faded, partly dying out, and partly dissolving into the incoming tide, their genes carried onward inside us, even as their distinct way of being human came to an end. Not so much exterminated as overwhelmed and absorbed. It should make us humble. There was nothing inevitable about which kind of human would still be here to tell the story. For all we know, in a slightly different roll of the dice, it would be a Neanderthal narrator telling you about the strange, gracile, big-headed people who once shared their world and then faded away. We are the survivors, but we are survivors carrying our cousins inside us, and that, I think, is a far truer and more moving picture than the old story of lonely conquest. Now, having met the Neanderthals, I cannot leave Ice Age Europe without showing you what our own ancestors did there once they had it to themselves. Because what happened next, in the freezing caves of France and Spain and Germany, is one of the supreme flowerings of the human spirit. It is the moment our ancestors started painting and carving and making music and reaching, across the dark of a cave wall, for something we are still reaching for today. Chapter 9: The Painted Dark, the Ice Age Masters. I want to take you deep into a cave, and I want you to carry a small, flickering flame because there was no other light. Imagine squeezing through cold stone passages, the dark pressing in, the only sound your own breath and the drip of water. And then you lift your little lamp, and the wall in front of you erupts into life. Horses, lions, rhinoceros, bison, great herds of them surging across the rock, drawn with a confidence and a beauty that would not embarrass any artist alive today. The animals are shaded to show the roundness of muscle. They are drawn in motion, galloping, charging, their legs multiplied to suggest the blur of movement, a technique we would not formally reinvent until the age of cinema. In the cave called Chauvet, in southern France, some of these paintings are around 36,000 years old. In Lascaux, that other great painted cathedral, a riot of horses and aurochs and deer covers the walls and ceiling. These are not crude scratchings by people learning to draw. They are the work of masters, of a tradition, of artists who knew exactly what they were doing. And here is the puzzle that I love about Chauvet, the thing that should stop you in your tracks. The paintings are stunningly sophisticated, and they are among the oldest we have. Where is the clumsy apprentice work that should come before such mastery? Where are the bad early drawings? Either they have been lost, or, and this is the thrilling possibility, the capacity for this kind of art arrived more or less fully formed, part of the cognitive equipment our ancestors carried out of Africa, switched on and ready to pour onto the first cave wall they had the leisure to decorate. The artist was already complete. They were only waiting for the wall. And it was not only painting. In caves in Germany, archaeologists found something that, when I first learned of it, I had to sit down. They found flutes. Actual musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bone and from mammoth ivory, with carefully drilled finger holes more than 40,000 years old. Someone made these. Someone played them. Around 40,000 years ago, in the freezing dark of an ice age, human beings sat together and made music. There were melodies in the world. There were songs we will never hear, drifting out of firelit caves into the snow. The oldest instruments on Earth, and they were made not for survival, but for beauty, for ritual, for the sheer human need to fill the silence with something lovely. They carved two small portable sculptures, the oldest figurative art we have. There are the so-called Venus figurines, little carved women, found across thousands of kilometers of Ice Age Europe, with their exaggerated curves, their fertile fullness. We do not know exactly what they meant: fertility charms, goddesses, self-portraits, talismans. We genuinely do not know, and anyone who tells you they are certain is selling something. But their sheer consistency across such vast distances tells you that Ice Age Europe was crisscrossed by shared ideas, a network of meaning stretched across a frozen continent. One of them, from a place called Dolny Vestonis, is made of fired clay, which makes it, astonishingly, the oldest ceramic object known anywhere in the world, baked in a hearth thousands of years before anybody thought to make a clay pot. But the object from this world that moves me most is a grave. At a site called Sungia in Russia around 34,000 years ago, people buried two children head to head, and they covered them in more than 13,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory. Experiments suggest each single bead took the better part of an hour to make. Do the arithmetic. That is something like 10,000 hours of labor, in beads alone, poured into the burial of two children. And here is the detail that breaks my heart and lifts it at the same time. The evidence suggests at least one of these children was physically disabled. In a hard, mobile hunting world where you might assume only the strong were valued, a community spent a staggering fortune of time and love to honor a disabled child in death. That is not the act of brutes scraping to survive. That is grief. That is reverence. That is unmistakably us. I do not want to over-romanticize their lives, because they were brutally hard. This was the last glacial maximum, the coldest depth of the Ice Age, and they lived on what is called the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, cold, dry grassland that stretched clear across the top of the world, from the Atlantic coast of Europe all the way to the edge of the Americas, grazed by herds of woolly mammoth and woolly rhino and wild horse and reindeer and bison. To live there, our ancestors had to become superb engineers of survival. They invented the eyed needle, which means they were sewing fitted, tailored clothing, the only way to survive those winters. In places where there was no wood, they built houses out of mammoth bones, great domed huts framed with tusks and jaws. They followed the herds, they read the land, they stored food, they kept the fires burning. They were not passing through this world as visitors. They had made themselves at home in one of the harshest environments the planet has ever thrown at our species, and they made it beautiful. This is the human texture I never want you to lose underneath all the maps and dates. Every single dot on the migration map I am drawing for you is people like this, people who grieved their children and sang and painted what they loved and shivered and told stories in the dark. The peopling of the planet is not an abstraction. It is billions of warm, frightened, hopeful, creative lives, each one as real and as full as yours. And now I want to take you to the exact opposite of this frozen world. Because while these artists were painting the cold caves of Europe, on the far side of the planet, other members of our family had already pulled off the single most astonishing feat of the entire journey, the one I opened with. They had crossed the open ocean to a new continent. It is time to go to Australia. Chapter 10: The Impossible Voyage, Reaching Australia. Come back with me to that beach from Chapter 1. Now, we have the tools to understand just how staggering what happened there really was. To get from Southeast Asia to Australia, even at the height of the Ice Age when the seas were at their lowest and many of the islands of Indonesia were joined into one great landmass, you could not walk. You never could. There is a zone of deep ocean channels in between. Biologists call it Wallacea, after the great naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who noticed that the animals on one side are utterly different from the animals on the other, because that deep water has always kept them apart. To get across, you had to cross open sea. The shortest possible crossing was still something like 70 to 90 kilometers of open water, much of it out of sight of any land. And people did it at least 65,000, perhaps 50,000 years ago, which is to say, tens of thousands of years before anyone built the pyramids, before farming, before the cave paintings of Lascaux. Human beings built watercraft and deliberately sailed across the open ocean to a continent they could not see. I want to dwell on why this is so important, because it is easy to skate past. This is the oldest hard evidence we have of human seafaring anywhere on Earth by a colossal margin, and it could not have been an accident. For a long time, people wondered whether maybe a few fishermen were swept out to sea by a storm and washed up by luck. But the math kills that idea. To found a viable population, enough people to not simply die out, you need many successful crossings, men and women both, again and again. A single lucky castaway is a dead end. What the peopling of Australia requires is intention. Boats good enough to make the trip repeatedly, and people deciding, over and over, to load up their families and steer for an horizon with nothing visible beyond it. It is the imagining mind in its purest, bravest form. They believed in a land they had never seen, and they bet everything, and they were right. And what did they find? They found a continent that had never known a human being, a strange, ancient land full of giant animals with no fear of us, which we will return to. And they spread across all of it with breathtaking speed, into the tropical north, down the temperate coasts, and most impressively of all, into the brutal, bone-dry deserts of the interior, learning to find water and food in a landscape that would kill an unprepared modern traveler in days. Within a few thousand years of stepping off those first boats, people were living in nearly every corner of Australia. At a rock shelter called Majidbeb in the north, we have that contested but increasingly accepted date of around 65,000 years ago, and a treasure of objects. Among the oldest ground-edge stone axes anywhere in the world, vast quantities of ground ochre for painting, and grinding stones for processing plant foods, showing these were not just hunters, but sophisticated gatherers with a deep knowledge of their land. And at Lake Mungo, in the dry heart of New South Wales, we have something sacred, the remains of a man buried with red ochre and of a woman who was cremated, both around 40,000 years ago or more. That cremation is the oldest known evidence of the practice anywhere on Earth. Think about what a cremation means. It means a belief about death, about what should happen to a body, about the spirit. It means ritual and planning and a whole structure of meaning around mortality 40,000 years ago on a continent our species had only recently reached. And now I get to tell you the most remarkable thing of all about the people who made that crossing, and it is not in the deep past, it is right now. The descendants of those first voyagers are still here. Aboriginal Australians have maintained a continuous presence and a continuous culture on that continent for 50,000 years and more, through ice ages, through the rising of the seas that cut Tasmania off from the mainland, through the extinction of the giant animals, through climate swings that remade the whole landscape without a break. They are, by a wide margin, the oldest continuous living culture on the face of the earth. No other people can trace an unbroken line, in one place, anywhere close to that long. The genetics confirm the depth of it. A founding population that arrived all those tens of thousands of years ago, and then settled into the land so thoroughly that distinct regional groups put down roots and stayed put, in some cases in the same country, for tens of thousands of years. There is a poignant footnote to this, too, a small parable about science and respect. When DNA was first taken from the ancient Lake Mungo remains, an early result suggested they fell outside the modern Aboriginal family, a finding that was seized on and that, frankly, could be and was misused. But it was wrong. It turned out to be contamination, the very enemy we met in Chapter 2. When the work was redone properly, the answer was unambiguous. The Mungo people are ancestral to living Aboriginal Australians. The continuity is real and unbroken, exactly as Aboriginal people had always said. The science, done carefully, confirmed the oldest oral traditions on Earth. We will return to those traditions and to what they encode at the end. For now, hold the wonder of it. The first great ocean voyage in human history led to the longest continuous human story on the planet. Now let me show you the second great age of ocean voyaging, a thing so audacious it makes even the crossing to Australia look modest. Let me take you out into the open Pacific. Chapter 11. The Greatest Sailors, Filling the Pacific. Look at a globe and turn it until all you can see is the Pacific Ocean. It is the largest single feature on the surface of our planet, an expanse of water so vast you could drop every continent into it with room to spare. And it is sprinkled, across that immensity, with thousands of tiny islands, many of them mere specks, hundreds or thousands of kilometers from the nearest neighbor, lost in a blue so big it is almost an abstraction. Every one of those islands that could support human life was found and settled by people in open canoes. Let that sink in. Without metal, without writing, without compass or chronometer or map, the ancestors of the Polynesians sailed out into the biggest ocean on Earth and found needles in a haystack the size of a hemisphere, and not once by luck, but systematically, deliberately, again and again, until they had settled a triangle of ocean with its corners at Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, an area covering something like a third of the globe. I think it may be the single greatest feat of exploration and navigation in the history of our species, and most people have barely heard of it. This great expansion came late, much later than the rest of our story. Its roots lie in a people archaeologists call the Lapita, who emerged in the islands near New Guinea around 3,000 years ago and spread east, marked by their beautiful, intricately stamped pottery. From bases in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, their descendants paused for a while, and then, in a burst that scholars sometimes call the express train, they launched the final, astonishing push out into the remote eastern Pacific, settling the scattered islands of central Polynesia, and then reaching Hawaii in the far north, Easter Island in the far east, and finally New Zealand, which has the distinction of being one of the very last large, habitable landmasses on Earth that humans ever reached. Settled only around 700 or 800 years ago. Think about that timeline. When Polynesian canoes were first beaching on the shores of New Zealand, the cathedrals of Europe were already old. The peopling of the planet was still going on, just yesterday in the scheme of this story. How did they do it? And here I get to introduce one of my favorite people in this entire episode, a man who lived in our own time. Because by the 20th century, many Westerners simply refused to believe that primitive islanders could have navigated such distances on purpose. They assumed it must have been accidental drifting. The traditional knowledge had nearly died out. But on a tiny island called Satawal, a master navigator named Maupiailug still held the old ways, learned through a decades-long apprenticeship, with no instruments and nothing written down. And in 1976, to prove it could be done, Mau navigated a reconstructed double-hulled voyaging canoe, the Hokulea, from Hawaii to Tahiti, thousands of kilometers of open ocean, using nothing but his knowledge. No compass, no charts, just his mind and the world. And the way he did it is so beautiful I have to describe it. A traditional Pacific navigator carries in his head a star compass, the rising and setting points of dozens upon dozens of stars, memorized so that the night sky becomes a vast, slowly turning dial of direction. By day, when the stars are gone, he reads the swells, the deep, long ocean waves generated by distant storms, which roll in steady, reliable patterns, so that a navigator lying down in the hull can feel the canoe's motion and know his heading from the rhythm of the sea against the boat, in total darkness. He reads the flight of birds at dawn and dusk, which fly out to fish in the morning and home to their islands at night, pointing the way to land still below the horizon. He reads the shape and color of clouds, which pile up and take on a green tint over an island long before the island itself appears. Every sense deployed at once, integrating star and swell and bird and cloud, and wind into a single living picture of where he is on the trackless sea. It is not mysticism. It is one of the most sophisticated bodies of applied natural science any human culture has ever developed, carried entirely in memory and passed down by word and practice across the generations. When Mao died, the knowledge did not die with him, because he had finally been persuaded to teach it widely, and a whole revival of traditional voyaging now sails the Pacific. The chain held. I cannot leave the great ocean voyages without two more wonders. The first is a voyage even most history buffs have never heard of, and it is one of the most improbable on Earth. The island of Madagascar, off the coast of Africa, was settled not primarily from Africa, which is just across a channel, but from Borneo, from island Southeast Asia, more than 5,000 kilometers away across the entire width of the Indian Ocean. We know this beyond doubt because the Malagasy language spoken there today is not African at all. Its closest relatives are languages of Indonesia. People crossed an ocean to settle an African island, and the proof is on their tongues. The second wonder is a genuine, still debated mystery, the sweet potato. It is a South American plant. And yet it was being grown across Polynesia, under a name strikingly similar to its Andean one, before any European reached the Pacific. How? The most likely answer, supported now by faint traces of Native American DNA in some eastern Polynesians, is almost too bold to believe. That Polynesian voyagers, having conquered the largest ocean on Earth, actually reached the coast of South America and came back. The greatest sailors in history may well have touched 2 continents and 1,000 islands, and we are still, right now, piecing together how far they really went. But there was one more frontier left for our restless species, not the warm blue Pacific, but its absolute opposite. The cold, the ice, the frozen top of the world. Let us go to the Arctic. Chapter 12, The Frozen Edge, Mastering the Arctic. There is a kind of courage in the human story that I think we undervalue, and it is the courage required not to cross an ocean in a single dramatic leap, but to settle, permanently, in a place that is actively trying to kill you every single day. And there is no better example than the peopling of the Arctic. Imagine choosing to live where the sun does not rise for weeks or months at a time, where winter temperatures fall far below anything most humans ever experience, where, for much of the year, there is almost nothing green to eat, no wood to burn, no shelter but what you can build from snow and bone and skin, where a single mistake, wet clothing, a wrong turn, a missed hunt means death. And yet human beings looked at that world and said, "We can live here." And they did, and their descendants live there still. The Arctic was one of the last places our species reached, precisely because it is so hard, and reaching it required not just bravery, but a stack of brilliant inventions. The peoples of the far north developed perfectly tailored, layered clothing of caribou hide and sealskin, engineered, genuinely engineered, to trap warm air and shed moisture, so effective that modern cold-weather gear is still based on the same principles. They built the kayak, that sleek skin-covered boat sealed around the hunter's body, and the larger umiak for carrying families and goods. They developed sophisticated harpoons with detachable, toggling heads designed so that a struck seal or whale could not pull free. They used dog teams and sleds to move fast across the ice and to reach hunting grounds far from the coast. Every one of these is a precision instrument for survival in a place with no margin for error. The deep history up there involves at least 2 great chapters. There was an earlier people. Archaeologists in that region speak of the Dorset culture, sometimes called the Paleo-Eskimo, who mastered the eastern Arctic and held it for many centuries, hunting seals at their breathing holes through the winter ice, carving exquisite little figures from ivory and bone. And then, around 1,000 years ago, a new people swept east out of the Bering Strait region. The Thule, the direct ancestors of today's Inuit. The Thule had certain decisive advantages, among them the dog sled and a highly developed technology for hunting the great bowhead whales. And as they expanded across the top of North America all the way to Greenland, the older Dorset people vanished. Whether the newcomers displaced them, absorbed them, outcompeted them, or whether a changing climate did the work, we are not entirely sure. It is another of those honest, open questions, and it rhymes, doesn't it, with the disappearance of the Neanderthals far away and long before. One people expanding, another fading, the precise mechanism lost in time. What is not in doubt is the continuity that came after. The Inuit peoples of today, across Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, are the descendants of those Thule pioneers, still carrying forward technologies and knowledge refined over 1,000 years on the ice. The kayak, the dog sled, the harpoon, the deep practical science of the Arctic. These are living traditions, an unbroken thread from those first masters of the frozen edge to the people who hunt and travel that country today. So now, in your mind, look at the map of the world and see how far we have come. From an African homeland, our family has reached the rainforests of Asia, the painted caves of Europe, the deserts and coasts of Australia, the scattered islands of the largest ocean on Earth, and the frozen rim of the Arctic. There is only one great landmass left unvisited in our story, two whole continents, in fact, joined at the waist, holding nearly a third of the world's land, the Americas. And to get there, our ancestors had to cross one final bridge, a bridge made not of land exactly, but of a lost world that is now beneath the sea. Chapter 13. Beringia, the Lost Continent. We call it a land bridge, and I want to take that phrase away from you gently because it has misled almost everyone who ever heard it. The words make you picture a narrow causeway, a kind of natural footbridge that people scurried across to get from Asia to America. That is not what it was at all, and the truth is so much grander. During the ice ages, when so much of the world's water was frozen into the great ice sheets that so much sea simply drained away, the shallow sea between Siberia and Alaska, what is now the Bering Strait, emptied out, and a vast plain rose up out of the water. At its widest, this exposed land stretched perhaps 1,000 kilometers from north to south. It was not a bridge, it was a subcontinent. We call it Beringia, and it was a real place, a whole world that human beings lived in, not crossed, but inhabited for thousands of years. And it is gone now. When the ice melted, the sea came back and drowned the entire thing. There is a sunken continent at the top of the Pacific, and our ancestors lived on it, and almost nobody knows it was there. Beringia was not frozen wasteland either. Much of it was that same mammoth steppe we met in Ice Age Europe, a cold, dry, productive grassland, grazed by mammoths and horses and bison and musk oxen, with all the predators those herds attract. It was a place you could live and hunt and raise children. And the genetics tell us that is exactly what happened in one of the most poignant ideas in this whole story, the Beringian standstill. Here is the idea. The ancestors of all Native Americans split off genetically from their East Asian relatives a very long time ago, perhaps 25 to 35,000 years ago. But they did not pour straight into the Americas. They couldn't. The route south was blocked by colossal ice sheets covering what is now Canada, a wall of ice from sea to sea. So they were trapped, held, for thousands of years in Beringia, that midway world, cut off from Asia behind them and America ahead of them. And during that long isolation, that standstill, they became distinct. Their genes drifted and settled into the particular pattern that defines Native American ancestry. By the time the way south finally opened, they were already a new people, forged in a lost land in between. The first Americans were, in a real sense, Beringians first. And we even have their faces, or at least the faces of some of their children. At a site in Alaska called Upward Sun River, archaeologists found the burial of two infants, a baby and a near newborn, who died around 11,500 years ago. The local native community gave them names in their own language: Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Girl Child. And when one of these infants' genomes was read, it revealed something astonishing. She belonged to a population that had split off even from the other early Americans, a previously unknown people we now call the ancient Beringians, a lost branch of a lost continent. Two baby girls, buried with care 11,000 years ago, who turned out to be the only known members of an entire vanished population of humanity. I think about them a lot. Now, how exactly did people finally get from Beringia down into the heart of the Americas? This is a live and genuinely exciting debate, and there are two main answers, and they may both be right. The old answer was the ice-free corridor. As the great ice sheets began to melt, a gap opened up between them, a north-south passage through what is now Western Canada, and people walked down it into the open continent below. The trouble is that when we date carefully when that corridor opened, and crucially when it became survivable, when it actually had grass and game and was not just a freezing channel of meltwater and mud, it seems to have come available a bit too late to account for the earliest signs of people further south. The corridor was real, and people surely used it, but it may not have been the first door. The newer answer is the one I find more thrilling, the kelp highway. The idea is that the first Americans came down the Pacific coast by boat, skipping past the ice altogether by sea. The coastlines of the North Pacific, even in the Ice Age, were lined with kelp forests, astoundingly rich ecosystems, full of fish and shellfish and seabirds and sea mammals, a continuous larder running all the way down from Alaska to California and beyond. A people with boats and a maritime way of life could have leapfrogged down that coast relatively fast, living off the sea the whole way. And it fits with what we have already learned, that our ancestors were sophisticated seafarers far earlier than we used to think. The great frustration, once again, is that the Ice Age coastline they would have traveled is now deep underwater, drowned by the same rising seas that swallowed Beringia. The most important evidence for the kelp highway is sitting on the sea floor. However they came, and again, it may well have been both the coast and, later, the corridor. Once they were through, something extraordinary happened. They walked into two entire continents in which there had never been a single human being, an untouched hemisphere. And what they did next was one of the fastest expansions in the whole human story, and it kicked off one of the bitterest scientific fights of the 20th century. Chapter 14. A New World, the Peopling of the Americas. For about 60 years, American archaeology had an answer it was absolutely certain about, and the certainty is part of the story, so let me give it to you straight. The answer was called Clovis first. In the 1930s, near a town called Clovis in New Mexico, archaeologists found beautiful, distinctive fluted stone spear points, and over the following decades these Clovis points turned up all over North America, dated to around 13,000 years ago. The points lined up neatly with the opening of that ice-free corridor, and a powerful idea crystallized. The Clovis people were the first Americans, full stop. They came through the corridor about 13,000 years ago, and before them the Americas were empty of humans. This became more than a theory. It became an orthodoxy, defended fiercely, almost an article of faith. And here is the human part. Archaeologists who claim to have found older, pre-Clovis sites were not just doubted. They were ridiculed, their careers damaged, their evidence dismissed before it was even examined. The field developed a kind of immune reaction against the very idea of anyone before Clovis. And then the orthodoxy fell. The site that broke it is called Monte Verde, and this is the deliciously surprising part. It is not in North America at all. It is in southern Chile, almost at the far end of South America. There, an archaeologist named Tom Dillehay excavated a settlement that was waterlogged and so exquisitely preserved that he found not just stone tools, but wooden tent stakes, hide, plant remains, even a child's footprint pressed into the ancient clay. And it dated to around 14,500 years ago, 1,000 years before Clovis, and at the wrong end of two continents. For years it was attacked, as everything pre-Clovis was attacked. But in 1997, a panel of senior skeptics traveled to the site to examine it in person, and they conceded. Monte Verde was real. The dam broke, And once people were finally allowed to see pre-Clovis evidence clearly, more of it turned up. The Americas had people before Clovis. The orthodoxy was simply wrong. I love this story, and I tell it deliberately, because it is the same lesson as the school teacher whose decipherment was rejected, the same lesson as George Smith and the flood tablet, the same lesson as those drowned coastlines and dead-end early migrations. Science is not a serene march of accumulating truth handed down by authorities. It is a brawl. It is stubborn individuals against entrenched consensus, evidence slowly grinding down certainty, the textbook getting torn up and rewritten. And the honest, thrilling thing is to hold that uncertainty as a feature, not a flaw. Right now, today, there are even bolder claims out there. Sites in Mexico, footprints in New Mexico, scattered hints that might push the first Americans back tens of thousands of years earlier still. Some of these will turn out to be solid. Some will melt under scrutiny like the Cerruti mastodon we met earlier. We are living inside an unfinished argument, and that is exactly what makes it exciting. Anyone who tells you the peopling of the Americas is a settled question is not telling you the truth. What is settled is the deep ancestry, and the genetics here did something beautiful. It laid to rest a string of toxic myths. There was, for instance, a persistent fringe idea called the Solutrean hypothesis, which held that the first Americans came not from Asia but from Ice Age Europe, across the Atlantic, an idea that, not coincidentally, some people found appealing for ugly reasons, because it put Europeans in the Americas first. The DNA killed it dead. A Clovis Age child from Montana, known to scientists simply as the Anzic child, was found to descend squarely from Asian and ancient Siberian ancestors, and to be directly ancestral to modern Native Americans across both continents. The first Americans came from the direction of Asia through Beringia, exactly as the genetics of living Native Americans had always indicated. Full stop. And then there is the case I find the most morally important in this whole episode. The man known to science as Kenuic Man, and to the native peoples of his land as the Ancient One. His roughly 9,000-year-old skeleton was found in Washington state, and because some early observers thought his skull looked unusual, not, to their eyes, typically Native American, there erupted years of speculation and a long legal battle. Local tribes said, plainly, "This is our ancestor, and he should be returned to the earth." Some scientists insisted he had no demonstrable link to modern tribes and should be studied, and the bones sat in limbo for the better part of 2 decades. Then they read his DNA, and the answer was unambiguous. The Ancient One is closely related to the very tribes of that region who had claimed him as their ancestor all along. The tribes were right. Their oral traditions of deep, continuous presence in that land were not myth, they were accurate history, confirmed by genetics. And he was, at last, repatriated and reburied according to their wishes. I find that case clarifying because it cuts through an old arrogance. For a long time, Western science assumed it had an automatic right to study indigenous ancestors and treated indigenous knowledge as quaint storytelling at best. Again and again now, the science is confirming what those traditions said, including, in one stunning case on the Pacific Northwest coast, an oral memory of a catastrophic nighttime earthquake and flood that geologists were later able to date precisely to the year 1700. 3 centuries of oral transmission, accurate to the year. These knowledge systems deserve respect, not condescension, and the future of this field lies in partnership with the descendant communities, not in working on them as if they were specimens. One last wonder before we leave the Americas, and it is the speed. Once people were truly through and into the open continents, they spread from Alaska to the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, the cold and windy end of the inhabited world, in something like 1 to 2,000 years. 15,000 kilometers, through every climate the planet can offer, in a span that is a blink in this story. They poured across two empty continents like water finding its level. And as they went, something followed them, or rather, something stopped existing where they arrived. Because the Americas, like Australia before them, had been full of giant animals. And just as in Australia, soon after people arrived, the giants began to die. Which brings us to one of the heaviest and most contested questions in our whole story, a question about what kind of creature we really are. Chapter 15, The Vanishing Giants. I want to lay out a pattern for you, and I want you to feel the weight of it, because it is one of the most sobering things in the human story. Before modern humans spread across the planet, the world was full of giants. Not in a fairy tale sense, really, literally full of enormous animals. In the Americas, mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of cars, beavers as big as bears, an armadillo-like creature the size of a small automobile, saber-toothed cats, a lion larger than any living today. In Australia, a wombat-like marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, kangaroos 3 meters tall, a monitor lizard longer than a car, a flightless bird heavier than an ostrich. In New Zealand, the moa flightless birds up to 3.5 meters tall. In Madagascar, giant lemurs and the colossal elephant bird. This was the normal state of the living world for millions of years. The planet was a place of giants. And then, one by one, region by region, they vanished. And here is the pattern that should make the hair stand up on your neck. The giants tended to disappear, again and again, right around the time human beings arrived. In Australia, the great beasts were mostly gone within a few thousand years of people getting there. In the Americas, a huge swathe of the large animals vanished within a window around the time of that rapid human spread. In New Zealand, the moa, which had no fear of humans at all, were hunted to extinction within roughly a century or two of the first Polynesians landing. In Madagascar, the giant lemurs and elephant birds went the same way after people arrived. The correlation is stark, and it is global, and it is hard to look away from. So did we do it? This is one of the great debates, and I want to give you both sides honestly, because it genuinely is not fully settled, and the stakes, moral as much as scientific, are real. The case that we did it is called the Overkill hypothesis, argued most forcefully by a scientist named Paul Martin. The logic is brutally simple. These giant animals had evolved for millions of years with no experience of a clever, cooperative, weapon-wielding pack hunter like us. They had no instinctive fear of people. A large, slow-breeding animal that does not run from you is heartbreakingly easy to kill, and animals that breed slowly cannot replace their numbers fast enough if you keep killing the adults. So as human hunters spread into a naive continent, Martin argued, they could have wiped out the big, trusting, slow-breeding giants in a geological instant, a wave of extinction rolling across each new land just behind the wave of people. The case against, or at least the case for its complicated, points at the climate. All of this happened during the dramatic upheavals at the end of the last ice age, when the world warmed, ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose, and habitats were turned upside down. Maybe the giants were really killed by that climate chaos, and the timing with human arrival is partly coincidence. But the climate-only story has a serious problem, and it is the most telling clue of all. It is Africa. Because Africa, where humans and these big animals evolved together, side by side, for millions of years, Africa kept its giants. The elephants, the rhinos, the hippos, the giraffes, the lions, they are still there. And the leading explanation is exactly that co-evolution. African animals grew up with us. As we slowly became better and better hunters over millions of years, They had time, evolutionarily, to learn to fear us, to adapt, to keep their distance. The animals of Australia and the Americas got no such warning. We did not develop alongside them gradually. We arrived, suddenly, already fully equipped as the most dangerous predator the planet had ever produced, into worlds of trusting animals that had never seen anything like us. The difference between the continent that kept its giants and the continents that lost them is, essentially, whether the animals had had time to get to know us. So where does that leave the verdict? The honest, current consensus is a synthesis, most likely a 1-2 punch. Climate change stressed and weakened these animal populations, and human hunting then pushed the already staggering giants over the edge. Not climate alone, not humans alone, but both together, with the human blow being, in many cases, the decisive one. And there are beautiful complicating clues that keep everyone honest. On remote Rangel Island in the Arctic, a population of woolly mammoths survived in isolation until astonishingly recently. Until around the time the pyramids were being built, long after mainland mammoths were gone, and they seem to have died out from the troubles of a small, isolated population rather than from human spears, because people apparently did not even reach the island until after the mammoths were already gone. Every neat story has its exception. I cannot leave this chapter without saying what it means, because it matters for how we understand ourselves. If the Ovical story is even partly right, and I think it is, then the peopling of the planet was not a gentle stroll into an empty Eden. It came at a tremendous cost to the living world. Our ancestors were not innocent children of nature. They were the most formidable predator in the history of the earth, and wherever they went, the largest and most magnificent animals tended to vanish. That is a hard thing to hold alongside all the wonder, the art, the courage, the navigation, the love poured into a child's grave. But holding both is the honest thing, and it is the more important thing because we are doing it again now, faster, to the animals that remain. The deep past is not only a tale of triumph, it is also the first chapter of a story about human power over the rest of life, a story whose latest pages we are writing right now. And now, at last, I want to take you back to the place I have been promising you since the very beginning, the great crossroads, the way station through which so much of this entire journey flowed. A subcontinent with a story so rich it could be an episode all its own, and which is, for so many of us, simply home. It is time to talk about India. Chapter 16. The Great Crossroads. India, the way station of the world. I told you hours ago that I was saving India, and I meant it, because India is not a footnote in the peopling of the planet. It is one of its main chapters. Look at a map of the great human dispersal out of Africa and along the rim of the Indian Ocean, and the Indian subcontinent sits right in the middle of everything. The vast hinge between Africa and Arabia to the west, and the whole of Southeast Asia and Australia to the east. Almost everyone heading east had to pass through, or around, or across it. India was the great way station of the human journey, and it was far more than a corridor people hurried through. It may have been one of the places where, for tens of thousands of years, our species paused, settled, multiplied, and gathered itself before flowing onward to fill the rest of the world. And the human story of the subcontinent goes back far, far deeper than our own species. India was home to humans of other kinds for an immense span of time before Homo sapiens ever arrived. At a site in the south called Aturampakam, near Chennai, archaeologists have found stone tools, beautiful, deliberate hand axes and cleavers that go back well over 1 million years, the work of earlier humans, of the kind we call Homo erectus, dispersing into Asia long, long before us. And at the very same site, there is something even more provocative. Evidence that the local tool-making shifted to a more sophisticated style remarkably early. hundreds of thousands of years ago, on a timeline that some researchers argue rivals or even predates similar developments elsewhere. It is debated hotly, but it raises a tantalizing possibility that the subcontinent was not just a place innovations passed through, but a place where innovation happened. Hold that as an open, exciting question. India may have been a cradle of cleverness in its own right. So when did we Homo sapiens arrive? And here we run straight into one of the liveliest debates in the field, and I want to give it to you fairly because there are serious people on both sides. One camp argues for an early arrival, that modern humans came down the southern coastal route and reached India quite early, perhaps 70 or even 75,000 years ago, before a great catastrophe we are about to discuss. The other camp argues for a later arrival, closer to 50,000 years ago, more in line with the genetic estimates for the main expansion of all non-Africans. The trouble at the heart of the argument is a deep one. Stone tools do not come with a label telling you which species of human made them. Without skeletons, without ancient DNA from the right period, and India's hot, humid climate is cruel to old bones and ancient genetic material. It can be genuinely hard to know whether a given set of very old tools was left by our kind or by an earlier kind. So the dates remain contested, and the honest position is to hold the range. Somewhere broadly between about 75 and 45,000 years ago, modern humans established themselves across the subcontinent, and they have been there ever since. And they left us windows into their inner lives that I find breathtaking. In central India, at a place called Bhimbetka, there is a complex of hundreds of rock shelters that were occupied, more or less continuously, for tens of thousands of years, one of the longest records of human habitation anywhere on Earth. And the walls of those shelters are covered in paintings, hunting scenes, dancing figures, animals, handprints, communal gatherings, layer upon layer of art built up over the ages. To walk through Bhimbetka is to walk through a gallery that human beings kept adding to for longer than almost any other place on the planet. It is India's own Lascaux, its own Chauvet, proof that the same symbolic, artistic, storytelling mind we met in the painted caves of Europe was at work here too, in the heart of the subcontinent, expressing the same deep human need to put what we love and fear onto a wall. There was a technological revolution here as well. Across India, starting tens of thousands of years ago, we see the spread of microliths, tiny, finely made stone blades, designed to be set into wooden or bone shafts to make composite tools and weapons, arrows and barbed spears and sickles. It is a sophisticated, efficient mass production technology, and its long, continuous presence in India, persisting for tens of thousands of years, all the way down toward recorded history, speaks of a deep, stable, evolving human presence, not a thin scatter of passers-through. People were living here in numbers, generation after generation, refining how they lived. Which brings us to the idea that I find the most exciting of all about India's role, sometimes called the Indian standstill, and I want to flag clearly that it is a hypothesis, a way of reading the evidence, not an established fact. The idea is this, that after arriving, our ancestors did not just trickle through the subcontinent and out the other side. They stayed. They settled into that vast, varied, resource-rich land, the coasts, the great river valleys of the Ganges and the Godavari and the Krishna, the forests, the plateaus. And over tens of thousands of years, they grew into a large, deeply rooted population. And it was from this great Indian reservoir of people, in this reading, that later waves flowed onward to help fill Southeast Asia, East Asia, and beyond. In other words, India may not have been merely a road. It may have been a wellspring, a demographic engine, a staging ground where humanity gathered its strength in the middle of the long march across the world. It is a beautiful idea, and the evidence for it is suggestive rather than conclusive, which is exactly the kind of edge-of-knowledge place I love to stand. But there is one episode in the deep history of the subcontinent that is not merely suggestive. It is one of the most dramatic survival stories in the entire human record. Because around 74,000 years ago, while our ancestors may already have been living in India, the largest volcanic eruption our species has ever witnessed exploded just to the southeast, and it buried the subcontinent in ash. For a long time, many scientists believed that catastrophe nearly wiped us out. India holds the key to whether that is true. Let me tell you about Toba. Chapter 17. The End of the World, Toba and the Survivors. About 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano named Toba did something almost beyond imagining. It erupted, not a normal eruption, but a super-eruption, one of the very largest in the entire span of the last several million years. The scale of it is hard to make real in words. It blasted out a quantity of rock and ash so vast that it left behind a crater you could lose a small country in. Today it holds the largest volcanic lake in the world. It threw a column of ash and gas dozens of kilometers up into the sky, and it rained ash across an enormous swathe of the planet. And it rained ash, in particular, across India. The whole subcontinent, more than 2,000 kilometers from the volcano, was blanketed in a layer of Toba ash, a layer so distinctive and so widespread that geologists can still find it, a pale band in the earth, and use it as a time marker across the whole region. Picture it, the sky darkening, the sun going dim, a fine grey ash sifting down for days or weeks, choking the rivers, smothering the plants, fouling the water, settling over every living thing. For any human being living in India at that moment, it must have seemed, quite literally, like the end of the world. And for a long time, many scientists thought it very nearly was the end of us, I mean. There was a powerful and dramatic idea called the Toba catastrophe hypothesis, which held that the eruption triggered a global volcanic winter, years of darkness and cold, collapsing ecosystems worldwide, and that it slammed the human population down to just a few thousand desperate survivors. A near extinction, a genetic bottleneck so tight that you could supposedly still see its mark in how little genetic diversity our species carries. In this telling, every human alive is descended from the handful who scraped through the Toba apocalypse. It is a gripping story. We almost didn't make it. But here is where India turns from victim into witness, and the story takes a turn I find genuinely inspiring. Because archaeologists went looking, in India, for the human record on either side of that ash layer, below it, from before the eruption, and above it from after. And what they found at sites like Jayawalapuram in the south was startling. The stone tools below the ash and the stone tools above the ash are essentially the same. The same techniques, the same traditions, continuing right across the catastrophe. Whoever was making those tools did not vanish when Toba blew. They were there before and they were there after, making their tools in the same way, as if a curtain of ash had fallen and then lifted and life had gone on. And the genetics has come around to the same conclusion. When researchers looked hard for the supposed signature of a catastrophic Toba bottleneck in human DNA, they could not convincingly find it. The dramatic, near-extinction version of the story does not hold up. The current view is far more interesting and, to me, far more moving. Toba was a real and regional catastrophe, genuinely terrible for those who lived through it, but it was not the global human apocalypse it was made out to be. People in India and elsewhere survived it. They endured the darkened skies and the poisoned rivers and the ruined hunting, and they adapted, and they came out the other side, and they carried on. I want you to sit with what that means, because it is one of the deep themes of this entire journey, written in fire and ash. Our ancestors were not fragile. Again and again across this story, crossing oceans they couldn't see across, settling deserts and ice fields, weathering the swings of the ice age, they show a resilience that is almost the defining feature of our kind. They got knocked down by one of the largest natural disasters the planet can produce, and they got back up. The survival through Toba is not a story of luck. It is a story of the toughness, the flexibility, the sheer stubborn adaptability of the human animal. We are the descendants of the people who did not quit when the sky went dark. And there is a final beauty to the Indian story, the most intimate of all, because the descendants of those ancient survivors are not gone. They are alive. They are walking around today. To meet them and to understand who they are, we have to do the thing this whole journey has been building toward. We have to read the genetic history written into the people of a subcontinent that is home to nearly a fifth of all humanity. And what that genetic history reveals will carry us, at last, out of India and straight into the deepest lesson of the entire human story. Chapter 18: The Ancestry of a Subcontinent. Far out in the Bay of Bengal, on the remote Andaman Islands, live some of the most extraordinary people on Earth, small communities, the Onge and the Jarawa and the great Andamanese among them, who lived in near total isolation from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. And when geneticists were finally, carefully, and respectfully able to study their ancestry, they found something that takes my breath away. These islanders carry some of the deepest, most ancient genetic lineages found anywhere outside Africa, branches of the human family that split off very near the base of the whole out of Africa expansion, and then stayed put, undisturbed, for tens of thousands of years. They are, in a real sense, a living link to the very first modern humans who came along that southern coastal route all those millennia ago. A window, still open, onto the founding population of the Eastern world. To understand why that matters so much, I have to introduce you to the genetic deep structure of the Indian subcontinent, because the story it tells is, I think, one of the most beautiful in all of human ancestry, and it was largely worked out only in the last decade or so, in a landmark study led by David Reich and Vagheesh Narasimhan and their colleagues, who read the DNA of hundreds of ancient and living people across South and Central Asia. And what they found is that almost every person in India today is a blend of two great ancestral streams that met and mixed. The first and older stream they call the ancient ancestral South Indians, and these are the deep ones, the descendants of those very first modern humans who reached the subcontinent in the great coastal migration tens of thousands of years ago, the same deep lineage the Andamanese preserve in near pure form. They are the original people of India, rooted in that land since the Ice Age. The second, much later stream came down from the northwest, beginning only a few thousand years ago, populations related to the early farmers of the Iranian world, and later to herders from the great grass steppes of Central Asia, the same restless steppe peoples whose relatives were spreading west into Europe at around the same time. This later stream is sometimes called the ancestral North Indians. And here is the thing that I find genuinely profound, the thing that makes the Indian story a perfect lens for the whole human story. These two streams, the deep, ancient, Ice Age people of the South and the later arrivals from the Northwest, met, and over the last few thousand years they mixed thoroughly and across the whole subcontinent. And the result is that essentially every population in India today, from north to south, from every community and background, is some blend of both. The proportions vary from group to group, but the mixing is universal. Everyone is mixed. There is no group that is only one stream. The deep ancestry, that ancient Ice Age inheritance from the first coastal pioneers, runs in everyone, and it is strongest of all in the tribal and southern peoples, including those Andamanese islanders who carry it almost undiluted, like a perfectly preserved sample of the human dawn. Do you see what this means? It means the people of India are not, and never have been, separate sealed lineages. They are a great confluence, two rivers of ancestry, one ancient and one more recent, flowing together into one. And as David Reich himself has put it, in a line I think deserves to be famous, there is no such thing as a pure population, not in India, not anywhere. The genetic study of the subcontinent does not reveal ancient, unchanging casts of blood. It reveals mixing, layered on mixing, layered on mixing, all the way down. The deepest, most rigorous reading of the DNA of a fifth of humanity says, unmistakably, you are all related, you are all blended, you are all, underneath everything, one extended and intermingled family. I have walked you all the way around the planet to arrive at this point, and I did it on purpose, because India tells in miniature what the whole world tells in full. The two great streams of India are themselves just branches of the one African family that left home 70,000 years ago. And just as in India, everyone turns out to be mixed, so in the world, every people, every nation, every so-called race turns out, when you read the actual chemistry of ancestry, to be a blend of older blends, with no pure source anywhere to be found. India is the lesson, and the lesson is about to become the whole point of everything we have done together. Because now I can finally tell you what the peopling of the planet actually proves, and it is the most important idea I have to give you. Chapter 19. We are all African. Let me say it as plainly as I can, because everything in this entire journey has been carrying us toward it. Every single human being alive on this planet today is descended from Africans. Everyone, without exception. Whatever you look like, wherever your family is from, whatever box you tick on a form, go back far enough, and your ancestors were Africans, and not even that long ago in the grand scheme of things. This is not a slogan, and it is not a political opinion. It is one of the best established facts in all of science, the converging conclusion of the fossils, the archaeology, and above all the genetics. We are one species of recent African origin, and the differences we see between the peoples of the world today are the product of just the last few tens of thousands of years. The blink of an eye of our ancestors adapting to different sunlight, different climates, different diets, in the different corners of the world they had so recently walked into. And the genetics carries a second fact that I find even more powerful, and I want to make sure you really grasp it, because it detonates something poisonous. Remember what I told you long ago about the founding group that left Africa carrying only a cupful of the whole ocean of human diversity. The consequence is this: there is more genetic variation within Africa than in all the rest of the human species put together. And more broadly, the overwhelming majority of all human genetic variation, something like 90-something% of it, exists within any given local population, not between the major geographical groups. What that means in plain language is staggering. Two people of the same so-called race can be, and often are, more genetically different from each other than from someone of a completely different race. The genetic differences between human populations are real, but they are shallow, recent, and superficial, mostly to do with the visible surface, the skin and hair and face that adapted to local sun and cold. While underneath, in the vast bulk of our biology, we are astonishingly, almost monotonously, the same. I need to be direct about why this matters so much, because for centuries it went the other way. For centuries, people built a vast and brutal edifice on the assumption that human races were deep, ancient, separate kinds of people, fundamentally different in their natures, naturally ranked from higher to lower. That assumption was used to justify slavery, conquest, empire, segregation, and genocide. It dressed itself up in the language of science and claimed the authority of nature. And it was wrong, not wrong as a matter of opinion, wrong as a matter of fact. The actual science of human ancestry, the real reading of the real DNA, demolishes it completely. Race, as a biological category of deep separate kinds of human, simply does not exist. There are no sharp genetic boundaries between peoples. Human variation is gradual and continuous, fading smoothly from place to place across the whole planet, with no lines anywhere. The categories were invented by human societies and then projected onto a biology that does not actually contain them. This is, to me, the deepest gift of the whole story I have been telling you. The peopling of the planet is the scientific death certificate of racism's central lie. When you understand that the person on the beach in Chapter 1 is the ancestor of everyone, that the family which crossed to Australia, and the family which froze in Beringia, and the family which stayed in Africa, and the family which mixed across India are all the same family, separated by a few tens of thousands of years, and reunited by the simple reading of their genes, then the entire foundation of racial hierarchy turns to sand. We are not ancient enemies. We are not separate creations. We are not higher and lower kinds. We are one young species born in Africa, scattered by accident and courage across the earth, and now, through the very science I have been describing, discovering our own deep kinship for the first time in our history. The people who built the racist edifice did not have this knowledge. We do. We have no excuse. And I want to be careful and honest here, the way I have tried to be all along, because there is a real ethical dimension to how this knowledge has been gained, and it would be a betrayal to skip it. The power to read the dead is an awesome power, and it has not always been used with respect. Indigenous peoples around the world have often had their ancestors dug up, carried off, and studied without their consent, as if their dead belonged to science rather than to them. The long fight over the ancient one, Kenuic man, that we met in the Americas, is only one example among many. The field is slowly, and not without resistance, learning a better way, that this research must be done with descendant communities, not on them, with consent, with partnership, with the right of a people to say no. The dead deserve respect, and so do their living descendants. A truer science is also a humbler and more collaborative one, and that too is part of growing up as a species. So that is what the peopling of the planet proves about who we are to each other, family, all of us, recently and provably. But the journey has one more thing to teach us, not about our past, but about our nature and about what is coming. Because the same restless, imagining, migrating impulse that filled the earth is still in us. It never switched off. And it is about to be tested again, on a scale we have not faced since the Ice Age. Chapter 20. The Restless Animal, Migration, Memory, and What Comes Next. I want to ask you a question that I think the whole of this journey has earned. What kind of animal are we, really? After everything, after the beach and the painted caves and the crossing to Australia and the canoes on the open Pacific and the dogs' sleds on the ice and the survival through Toba, what is the one trait that runs through all of it, the thread that ties the whole human story together? I think it is this: we are the animal that moves. We are the restless ones. We are the species that could never quite leave the horizon alone. For the entire span of this story, and it is the longest story there is, human beings have responded to hardship, to opportunity, to curiosity, to a drying climate or a crowded valley or simply the question of what might be over there by getting up and going. When the Sahara turned green, we walked into it. When it dried, we walked back out. When the seas fell and exposed new land, we spread onto it. When they rose and drowned it, we retreated and went somewhere else. We followed the herds, we followed the coasts, we followed the stars across the open ocean. Movement is not something that occasionally happened to our ancestors. Movement is what they were. It is, I would argue, the single most defining and most successful behavior in the history of our kind. Staying put is the historical exception. Going is the rule. And underneath the movement is that one cognitive gift I keep coming back to, the one I called the spark, the imagining mind. Because to migrate, truly to migrate, you have to be able to do a very strange thing. You have to be able to picture a place you have never seen and believe in it and risk everything on it. The person on the beach in Chapter 1 could only get into that boat because, behind their eyes, there was an image of a land beyond the horizon, a land for which they had no evidence at all, except the conviction that the world is bigger than what they could see and worth going to find. That capacity to imagine the unseen and stake your life on it is the engine of the entire peopling of the planet. And it is the same capacity that much later would build cathedrals and write symphonies and send machines to other worlds. The restlessness and the imagination are two faces of one thing. We are the creature that cannot stop wondering what is out there and cannot stop going to look. I want to give you one gorgeous example of how deep this runs and how our ancestors carried it with them, because it brings us back to the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Among Aboriginal Australians, there is a tradition called the Songlines, and I find it one of the most extraordinary human achievements I know of. A songline is, on the surface, a song or a cycle of songs and stories that traces a path across the land, the journey of an ancestral being, sung in sequence. But it is so much more than that. It is, all at once, a map, a law code, a library, and a scripture. By knowing the song, you know the route. The song names the waterholes and the landmarks and the dangers in order, so that a person who has never walked a stretch of country can navigate hundreds of kilometers across it by singing their way along, because the song is the country, encoded into memory and melody. The songlines are a way of storing immense quantities of practical, ecological, legal, and spiritual knowledge. How to find water, where the food is, what the law is in this place, what happened here in the deep past, and carrying all of it accurately across the generations, with no writing at all, for thousands upon thousands of years. And here is the part that genuinely stuns me. There is real evidence that some of these traditions encode knowledge that is astonishingly old. There are Aboriginal stories, told along songlines, that appear to describe coastlines and landmarks that are now underwater features that have been submerged since the seas rose at the end of the Ice Age, more than 10,000 years ago. Which would mean that human memory, carried in song, has preserved an accurate description of the shape of the land for over 10 millennia. We met this idea before, with that Pacific Northwest memory of the Great Earthquake, accurate to the year over 3 centuries. The songlines may push the same astonishing capacity back to the very edge of the Ice Age. Before writing, long before writing, human beings built a technology for remembering across deep time, and they built it out of nothing but song and story and the trained human mind. The same mind that could imagine the unseen beach could also remember the lost coastline and sing it forward to the unborn. That is who we are. Now let me bring this home, all the way to right now, to this century, to the news, because the restless impulse that filled the planet has not gone anywhere. It is in us still, and we are walking into an age in which it is going to be tested again, on a scale our species has not faced since the great climate upheavals of the Ice Age. The deep past is absolutely unambiguous on one point. When the climate changes, people move. They always have. A drying Sahara, a rising sea, a failing food supply, and human populations get up and go because the alternative is to stay and die. That is the oldest pattern in our history, written across every chapter of this journey. And now we ourselves are changing the climate, warming the world, raising the seas, drying the croplands, intensifying the storms. And the consequence is as predictable as anything in human affairs. In the coming decades, large numbers of people will be on the move, displaced by a changing planet, exactly as our ancestors were displaced over and over for 70,000 years. There is a haunting symmetry here, and the cradle itself shows it. The very lands where so much of this story unfolded, the Middle East, parts of South Asia, the African Sahel, are among those most exposed to the heat and drought now coming. But here is the paradox I want to leave you to wrestle with, because I think it is one of the most important ideas in this entire episode. For 70,000 years, migration was our greatest strength, the very thing that let us survive every catastrophe the planet threw at us, the thing that filled the earth, the thing that made us who we are. And today we have turned migration into a crisis, a threat, a thing to be walled out and feared. Why the difference? Partly because the world is full now, 8 billion of us, almost every habitable place already claimed, no empty continents left to walk into. Partly because we have carved the planet into nations with hard borders, so that the oldest and most natural human act, simply moving to where you can live, has become an act fraught with politics and fences and fear. The impulse to move is not a modern aberration or a sign of disorder. It is the deepest, most ancient, most human thing there is. Our entire species exists because our ancestors were migrants, because they refused to stay and die and chose instead to go and live. When we look at people on the move today and see something alien and threatening, we are looking at our own deepest nature and failing to recognize our own family. I am not going to pretend that the deep past hands us a tidy policy. It doesn't, and I promised you honesty over neatness. The world really is different now, fuller and more bordered, and there are no easy answers. But the deep past does hand us a perspective, and I think it is a profound one. It tells us that the human story has always been a story of movement, of mixing, of people from one place becoming the ancestors of people in another. It tells us that there has never been a pure people or a sealed homeland or a population that stayed put forever. Those things are illusions, every one of them. And it tells us that the qualities our ancestors needed to survive their great migrations, courage, imagination, adaptability, and above all the willingness to see strangers as potential kin rather than enemies, are exactly the qualities we are going to need again. The peopling of the planet is not a finished story in a museum case. It is the prologue to our own century. We are still, all of us, migrants and the children of migrants, and the journey is not over. Which brings me at last back to where we began, back to the beach. Let me bring this whole journey home. Chapter 21. The Unbroken Chain. I told you hours ago to stand on a beach with the sun going down and to feel what it was to get into a boat and steer for a horizon with nothing visible beyond it. I want to end by going back there, because now you know who that person was, and now you know what they began. That person did not know they were making history. They were not thinking about the peopling of a planet. They were thinking, probably, about their children and about the next island and about whether the weather would hold. They were just a human being, doing the most human thing there is, looking at the edge of the known world and deciding to go past it. And from that one small, frightened, hopeful act, and millions of acts like it, repeated over tens of thousands of years, came everything. Came the whole inhabited earth. Came every city and language and song and face on the planet. Came you. Because here is the thing I most want you to carry away from our time together. There is an unbroken chain that runs from that person on the beach to you, listening to this right now. It runs through every single one of your ancestors in an unbroken line, no link ever missing, because if even one of them had died before having children, you would not exist. Every one of them survived long enough to pass life on. Every one. Through the Toba ash and the ice age cold, through the ocean crossings and the desert droughts, through famine and predator and disease, and 1,000 near misses we will never know about. Every single one of your direct ancestors made it through and had a child and handed the torch forward. You are the current end of a chain of survivors that stretches back, unbroken, through the painted caves and the drowned coastlines, all the way to a small band of Africans, and through them all the way back to the very origin of life itself. You are not a spectator to this story. You are its living conclusion, so far. And I want you to feel how recent it all is, how close, because that is the part that undoes me. We did not do this in some unimaginable abyss of time. On the scale of the universe, on the scale even of life on Earth, the peopling of the planet happened essentially yesterday. A few thousand generations, that is all that separates you from the people who first crossed to Australia, from the artists of Chauvet, from the survivors of Toba. If you could line up your direct ancestors, mother behind mother, each holding the hand of the next, the line would not even be very long before it reached a woman in Ice Age Asia, and not so very much longer before it reached a woman in Africa under a sky with no cities in it at all. They are not strangers in a textbook. They are your grandmothers and grandfathers, close enough to touch. The deep past is not far away. It is in your hands, in your face, in the very fact of your existence. And remember what that chain proves, the thing this whole journey has been quietly building toward. The chain that runs back to you runs back to the same place as the chain that runs back to every other person alive. We are not many stories. We are one story with 8 billion living endings. The man on the cliff in Gibraltar, and the navigator on the Pacific swell, and the child buried in beads at Sungia and the islanders of the Andaman Sea, and the people of the Songlines and the family that never left Africa at all, they are all, every one, our family, separated by nothing more than a few tens of thousands of years and a few different sunsets. When you meet a stranger, you are meeting a cousin you lost touch with around the last ice age. That is not sentiment. That is the literal, demonstrated, scientific truth of who we are. There is no them. There was never any them. There is only us, and there only ever was. So the next time you look at a world map, I want you to see it differently. I want you to see the arrows, the great slow currents of people flowing out of Africa and across Arabia and along the coasts of Asia, branching south to Australia and north into the cold, pouring across the bridge into the Americas, fanning out across the impossible Pacific, the whole planet slowly filling with the warm light of human presence over 70,000 years. I want you to see that map not as a picture of separate nations, but as the single greatest journey ever undertaken, your family's journey, the one that ends with you. And the next time someone tells you that people are fundamentally different, that some are higher and some are lower, that there are pure peoples and natural enemies and strangers who do not belong, you tell them about the beach. You tell them about the cupful from the ocean and the more genetic diversity in Africa than in all the rest of us. You tell them that the deepest reading of our own blood says there is no such thing as a pure people anywhere on earth, that we are all of us blends of blends, all the way down, all the way back to one African family. You tell them that the science is in, and the science says, we are one. That is what the peopling of the planet really gives us. Not just a thrilling story of how we got everywhere, though it is that, the most thrilling story there is. It gives us a mirror, And in the mirror is a single, restless, imagining, migrating, astonishingly resilient family who looked at the edge of the world and could not help but go past it, and who carried each other, link by unbroken link, all the way down to you. Thank you for traveling the whole earth and the whole of deep time with me. This has been the story of how we peopled the planet, the story of you. Tonight, if you can, step outside and look at the horizon. Any horizon, the end of your street will do. Our ancestors looked at exactly that line, the place where the known world stops for 70,000 years, and something in them always whispered, "There is more out there, and I am going to go and find it." That whisper is still in you. It is the oldest thing you own. Go and see what is over the horizon. You come from a very long line of people who did.